It was supposed to be a minor procedural formality. Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman and a seasoned civil rights attorney, was scheduled for a brief court appearance in Dallas Municipal Court. The case? A citation for a parking violation, an ironic ticket given to her car, while she was meeting with housing advocates about illegal evictions just blocks away. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had no plans to challenge the ticket. Just show up, pay the fine, and move on, except this morning didn't go as planned. At precisely 8:47 a.m., Crockett's team received a frantic call from her legislative director in D.C. The Department of Justice had just released preliminary findings on discriminatory eviction practices disproportionately targeting black families in South Dallas, something Crockett had been tracking for months. The timing of the findings was politically delicate. She had to coordinate with both HUD and local city officials immediately. The call ran long. Too long. By the time Jasmine stepped into Courtroom 3B, it was 9:19 a.m., 19 minutes past the scheduled appearance. She entered the courtroom with her signature poise, wearing a navy suit crisp from the press, heels clicking, confidently against the polished floor. But the moment her presence was announced, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Ronald Jeffries, a silver-haired figure with an air of inflated authority, barely glanced up from the bench. "Congresswoman Crockett," he intoned, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "How gracious of you to join us this morning." Jasmine met his gaze with calm assertiveness. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor. I was on an urgent call with the Department of Housing and Urban Development regarding matters directly affecting this district." Jeffries didn't wait for her to finish. "Save it," he snapped. "This is a courtroom, not Capitol Hill. You may be used to grandstanding in front of cameras, but here you follow the rules. You're held in contempt." A murmur swept through the courtroom. "Contempt?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady. "For being 19 minutes late due to an emergency related to my congressional duties?" "For disrespecting this court," Jeffries barked. $50 fine, payable immediately." Crockett raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling her phone from her purse to authorize the payment. The court clerk took the card without looking her in the eye. It was small, the fine, petty even. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the performance, the spectacle. Jeffries was making an example of her. She could have let it end there. But Jasmine Crockett was not built for silence in the face of systemic disrespect. "Your Honor," she said, after the fine was recorded, "I'm compelled to ask, would this courtroom have reacted with the same level of hostility if I were a white male attorney arriving late under similar circumstances?" The room stiffened. Jeffries leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Ms. Crockett. I'm asking a question relevant to equal treatment under the law," she replied. "I'm not here for your political theater," Jeffries snapped. "You're skating close to another contempt charge." That's when it shifted. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She took a step forward, keeping her voice clear and sharp enough to cut through the silence. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it's not political theater to question whether bias is at play in a courtroom. It's a civic responsibility, especially for someone sworn to uphold the Constitution." The judge's gavel struck the bench once, loud, definitive. "That's enough." But Jasmine didn't back down. "Your Honor, you just held me in contempt for a delay related to my work as an elected official, serving the very community this court presumes to protect. Meanwhile, I've seen white attorneys stroll in late, here without consequence. I have receipts, I have dates, and I have witnesses." Jeffries glared at her, jaw tight. Someone in the courtroom gasped. From the back row, a local reporter from the Dallas Morning Ledger began quietly typing on her phone. The tension was molten. Either I'm wrong, and this court applies its rules fairly across the board, Jasmine continued, or I'm right, and this moment, this exact moment, deserves the scrutiny of the Judicial Conduct Review Board. Jeffries's face turned a shade redder. "Ms. Crockett, you are on extremely thin ice." "And yet," she said coolly, "I'm standing firm." He didn't respond. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Loaded with the weight of decades of systemic bias, the arrogance of unchecked authority, and the power of someone unafraid to challenge it. The bailiff's eyes darted between them, as if bracing for what might happen next. Jasmine took a final glance around. The room. It wasn't just about her. She saw the quiet stares from black and brown attendees sitting in the back, many of them likely dragged in for their own low-level offenses, hoping for leniency in a courtroom that had already decided their worth before they even walked in. She looked back at Jeffries, and then she said, "I move for recusal." A stunned pause followed. Jeffries scoffed, the smirk returning to his face. Denied. But Jasmine had already planted the seed, and Courtroom 3B had just become the epicenter of something far bigger than a parking ticket. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise higher over downtown Dallas. Inside, a storm had only just begun. The courtroom remained frozen in silence, the air charged with the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's bold challenge. Judge Jeffries sat still for a beat too long, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing just how far he was willing to let this spiral. But Jasmine hadn't come to be another. Name steamrolled in silence. She had come, as always, to speak truth, regardless of who it made uncomfortable. "I repeat," Jasmine said, locking eyes with the judge again, "I move for your recusal from this case on grounds of demonstrated bias and retaliatory conduct." Jeffries leaned back slowly, theatrically. "You believe I'm retaliating against you over a parking citation, Congresswoman?" "I believe you used your authority to publicly reprimand and fine me not for my conduct," Jasmine replied, "but for who I am, what I represent, and the fact that I had the audacity to speak when you expected submission." Gasps echoed. Again. A young black man sitting near the back muttered, "Damn," under his breath. Jeffries struck his gavel twice, harder this time. "Enough grandstanding, you've made your little statement. Now either conclude your business with this, court, or I will have you escorted out." Jasmine didn't blink. "If I'm to be removed, let the record show it's for questioning racial bias in a public courtroom." A murmur of support rippled through the gallery. Reporters were now openly recording on their phones despite the posted signs forbidding it. The clerk glanced nervously at Jeffries, who was visibly unsettled by the shifting momentum. From the corner of her eye, Jasmine noticed two of the assistant district attorneys lean in toward one another, whispering. One of them, a Latina woman named Avelina Torres, didn't look away when Jasmine's eyes met hers. There was a flicker of solidarity there, silent but undeniable. Jeffries finally exhaled, like he was trying to drag the temperature of the room back under his control. "Ms. Crockett, you may be an elected official, but in this courtroom, you are a defendant. I will not indulge this circus. Now sit down and allow me to finalize your citation." But Jasmine didn't sit. Instead, she stepped closer to the bar, separating the audience from the attorney's floor. "Let the court take judicial notice," she said clearly, "that the Honorable Judge Ronald Jeffries has issued a contempt charge for tardiness caused by a legitimate governmental emergency, refused to address potential racial disparities in courtroom treatment, and denied a recusal request without hearing arguments or considering a written motion." Jeffries was visibly boiling now, his hands clenched on the bench. "I don't care what office you hold. You are not entitled to lecture this court." "Bailiff—" "Try it," Jasmine cut in, her tone icier now. "Try removing a sitting U.S. representative from a courtroom because she refused to be disrespected by a man who should have retired when dial-up internet was still a thing." Even a few snorts of laughter slipped through the tension. Jeffries slammed the gavel again. "You are dangerously close to criminal contempt, and you're dangerously close to a federal ethics complaint. Your call." The bailiff hesitated, clearly unsure whether to act. Jeffries noticed and barked, "Well, remove her!" But the bailiff didn't move. Instead, the door at the rear of the courtroom opened, and in stepped two new faces, representatives. From the Judicial Oversight Commission. Word had traveled fast. They were supposed to be there next week for a scheduled review of procedural fairness, but someone had tipped them off early, and Jasmine knew exactly who it was. From the gallery, Avelina Torres stood up. "Your Honor," she called out calmly, "as an officer of the court, I'd like to request a brief recess in light of emerging concerns about judicial conduct. This courtroom may be under review sooner than expected." Jeffrey's head whipped toward her. "You're out of order, Ms. Torres." "No, sir," she said evenly. "You are." Gasps again. The momentum had officially shifted. Jeffries looked like he had swallowed glass. He reached for his gavel again but stopped short of slamming it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the Oversight Commission observers, who had already begun taking notes. The judge had lost the room. Still standing, Jasmine turned, slowly toward the gallery. Her voice lowered just enough to be intimate, just enough to cut deep. "This isn't about a parking ticket. It never was. It's about power, and how it's used when no one thinks anyone's watching. But now, people are watching." Reporters were already tweeting. Crockett confronts courtroom bias head-on. Sparks fly. Live from Dallas Municipal, Congresswoman, versus Judge. Race, power, contempt. Jeffries under scrutiny as oversight reps enter courtroom mid-hearing. In the back, a producer from a local news station dashed out to prep a live feed. But Jasmine wasn't playing to cameras. She was playing for the people who had come to court expecting injustice, and gotten it. She was playing for the woman in the second row, clutching a toddler and a citation. The college student whose traffic ticket somehow became an arrest warrant. The man in construction boots who had clearly taken off work, likely unpaid, just to be heard. Jasmine turned back to the bench one last time. "If we want fairness in this legal system, it has to start here, in these rooms where people's lives get decided by judges who can't be bothered to check their own bias. And I'm not going anywhere until that conversation happens." For a moment, Jeffries said nothing. Then finally he looked down. At his notes, at his gavel, at anything but her. "This court is in recess," he muttered, then rose and disappeared behind the judge's door. But the silence that followed wasn't the kind he was used to. It wasn't fear, it was ignition. Jasmine stayed standing, even as the court emptied. The oversight reps approached her quietly. One handed her a card. "We'd like to speak with you further, Congresswoman." Outside, the media had gathered. Microphones were being raised. Cameras pointed toward the courthouse steps. And Jasmine Crockett, lawyer, Congresswoman, unapologetically black, was about to take the fight outside. The courthouse doors swung open as Jasmine emerged into a wall of flashing cameras and shouts from reporters. The warm Texas sun glinted off lenses, and microphones as a crowd surged forward, phones raised, mics extended like drawn weapons. She didn't flinch. If anything, she stood taller. "Congresswoman Crockett, what happened in there? Do you believe Judge Jeffries acted out of racial bias? Are you planning to press charges or file a formal complaint?" The questions came rapid-fire, a cacophony of voices competing for her attention. She raised one hand. The crowd hushed almost instantly. "I will make a brief statement," she said, voice strong and unwavering. "This morning, during what should have been a simple, uneventful appearance for a parking citation, I was fined and threatened with arrest for being 19 minutes late, because I was handling a federal housing emergency directly impacting my constituents. What followed was not just about me, it was about a pattern, a power dynamic, a courtroom culture that permits and protects bias." The crowd was still. "Let me be clear," she continued. "I was not the first person Judge Jeffries has treated with disdain, but I intend to be the last. We cannot allow courtrooms, places that are supposed to be sanctuaries of justice, to operate as fiefdoms of unchecked power and prejudice. What I witnessed today was not impartiality. It was a performance, and the performance was about control. A reporter from a national outlet called out, "Are you accusing Judge Jeffries of racism?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm accusing Judge Jeffries of consistent, documented bias that disproportionately affects black and brown defendants. And if anyone's still unclear on the definition of systemic racism, I'd invite them to spend a day in Courtroom 3B. Gasps rippled. Again, this time from the press corps itself. Behind her, Avelina Torres stood near the courthouse doors watching silently. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. Jasmine gave her a subtle nod before turning back to the cameras. "Today isn't about me getting the last word. It's about starting a conversation that this city, and this country, has been too afraid to finish. Equal protection under the law doesn't mean equal words in a statute. It means equal treatment in rooms like the one I stood in this morning." She stepped down from the courthouse steps, walking through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. By mid-afternoon, the video of the courtroom clash had gone viral. Major networks ran the footage on a loop. CNN picked up the feed within hours. Hashtags like Crockett vs. Jeffries, courtroom bias, and contempt of justice trended across platforms. What started as a minor citation had grown into a full-blown reckoning. Within the hour, civil rights organizations began issuing public statements. The ACLU of Texas launched a formal call for investigation into Jeffries' judicial history. Local activists released affidavits from past defendants, black and brown residents who spoke of humiliating treatment, excessive fines, and arbitrary contempt charges. But not everyone was on Jasmine's side. The Dallas Bar Association released a cautious statement warning against the politicization of courtroom decorum. Conservative pundits accused her of weaponizing race and playing victim to dodge responsibility. One anchor on a far-right network sneered, "If she can't handle being told to follow the rules, maybe she's not fit for public office." Jasmine didn't flinch. She was built for this. That evening, she convened a press briefing in her district office. Cameras rolled as she stood before a wall of community members, past defendants, local attorneys, activists, clergy. Not a single empty chair. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said into the mic. "I'm demanding accountability." From the back of the room, someone shouted, "You've got it!" Applause broke out, not for a show, but for a shared reality. But behind the scenes, tension was thick. Jasmine's chief of staff warned her that backlash was mounting. Anonymous threats had already begun to trickle in. Social media trolls flooded her mentions. An unmarked envelope had arrived at her D.C. office, empty except for a single typed line. "You should have stayed in your lane." She read it once and dropped it in a file marked Security Review. By the next morning, the story had gone national. A New York Times op-ed titled, "The Courtroom Clash That Could Change Everything," ran with a sharp lead. What started as a $50 fine may cost Judge Jeffries his robe. And yet, the judge himself remained silent. No interviews, no statements. Behind closed doors, however, things were shifting. Sources within the courthouse began leaking internal memos, whispered accounts of past complaints against Jeffries. Dozens of them, quietly dismissed or ignored. A pattern emerged. He had consistently imposed harsher penalties on defendants of color. He interrupted them more, fined them more, silenced them more. And now finally the curtain was being pulled back. An emergency meeting of the Judicial Oversight Commission was scheduled for Friday. Rumors swirled that Judge Jeffries had retained legal counsel. Meanwhile, Jasmine wasn't slowing down. She launched a task force partnering with civil rights lawyers and policy advocates to draft legislation for mandatory bias training for municipal judges, community-led courtroom observation programs, and new oversight powers for the Judicial Review Board. But not everyone inside the system was thrilled. At City Hall, power brokers began to circle the wagons. Some council members worried about the optics. Others whispered that Jasmine was being too aggressive. But she wasn't listening to them. She was listening to the people lining up outside her district office, sharing their own courtroom, horror stories. She was listening to the teenage boy who had been fined $300 for walking through a park after hours. To the single mom who had her license suspended over a clerical error. To the Iraq War veteran who had been dragged through court over a $25 trash collection ticket. One by one, their voices became part of something bigger. A movement. And by Thursday, that movement reached a boiling point. A coalition of legal scholars, former judges, and elected officials issued a public demand. Suspend Judge Jeffries. Pending investigation. The pressure was mounting. And inside the courthouse, Judge Jeffries, once so smug and unshakable, was starting to unravel. He was seen storming out of his chambers, berating a clerk for not screening who's coming in. Staffers whispered about documents being shredded. He knew. The storm Jasmine had brought was no longer outside. It was at his door. Friday morning arrived with an eerie stillness inside the Dallas Municipal Courthouse. The lobby, usually humming with low murmurs, rustling papers, and the occasional barked order, was nearly silent. News crews stood like statues outside. Reporters spoke in hushed voices. Everyone was waiting, watching. Upstairs in a private conference room just beyond Courtroom 3B, the Judicial Oversight Commission convened behind closed doors. Inside were transcripts, affidavits, disciplinary records, and testimonies. But what weighed heaviest in the air wasn't the paperwork. It was the moment, the reckoning. Jasmine Crockett sat across from the commissioners, wearing the same calm resolve she'd carried all week. No theatrics, no anger, just truth. "I didn't set out to start a firestorm," she said plainly. "I went to court because I had a parking ticket. But what I walked into was not justice. It was a performance of power, and it was designed to humiliate me. Not because I broke the law, but because I didn't play the part Judge Jeffries expected from someone like me." One commissioner leaned in. "What part is that, Congresswoman?" "The quiet one," she replied. "The submissive one, the kind who doesn't speak back when she's spoken down to." There was a long pause. One by one, the commissioners nodded. Downstairs, Courtroom 3B filled again. This time, not with defendants or lawyers, but with members of the public. Residents, activists, court observers, law students. The gallery overflowed. Security stood at the door, not to keep people out, but to keep order. The energy wasn't riotous. It was reverent. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here for history. At 10:03 a.m., the door to the judge's chamber creaked open. Judge Ronald Jeffries stepped out slowly, his once confident gait now heavy, labored. The robe he wore hung off him like a costume he no longer believed in. His eyes, once quick to narrow in judgment, avoided contact with anyone. He sat at the bench. The gallery fell into silence. A court officer entered and handed a sealed envelope to the clerk, who passed it to Jeffries. He opened it, read, paled, then looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, clearing his throat, "I have received the findings of the Judicial Oversight Commission, which I have been advised to read into the record." He shifted in his seat. "The Commission has found sufficient evidence of long-standing patterns of judicial misconduct, including but not limited to the disproportionate issuing of contempt citations to defendants of color, frequent denial of procedural rights, and failure to maintain impartial decorum on the bench, effective immediately. I have been suspended pending formal removal proceedings." Gasps shot through the gallery. Phones went up, cameras flashed. But Jasmine sat still, hands folded in her lap. No smile, no fist pump. Just a deep, steady breath. Jeffries continued, voice cracking slightly. "I have also been informed that the State Commission on Judicial Conduct will be initiating a full review of my case history." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The gavel came down, one final time, not in control, but in surrender. I am adjourning this court indefinitely, and just like that, it was over. Jeffries stood slowly, handed his robe to the clerk, and walked out. Not to applause, not to protest, but to a silence so complete, it felt like justice catching its breath. Outside, the crowd had doubled. When Jasmine emerged, she wasn't alone. She walked alongside local pastors, former defendants, students, and attorneys, people who'd felt the weight of the system on their backs for far too long. Reporters swarmed again, but she didn't rush to the microphones this time. She turned to the crowd first. "This moment isn't about the fall of one judge," she said. "It's about the rise of accountability." Applause broke out. Not wild, but strong. Steady. The courtroom isn't supposed to be a stage for ego. It's supposed to be a sanctuary for fairness. Today, we took a step toward that ideal. But this work doesn't end with one resignation or one investigation. It begins there. She paused, eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, some teary-eyed, some smiling, some still stunned. This week, a parking ticket turned into a movement, and that movement turned into momentum. And now it turns into law. Later that month, Jasmine introduced the Judicial Integrity and Bias Prevention Act, a sweeping federal proposal mandating annual anti-bias training for all judges in municipal and state courts, transparent reporting on courtroom outcomes by race, gender, and income level, the creation of independent community court watch panels with oversight power, a national hotline for reporting judicial misconduct tied directly to the DOJ. The bill gained bipartisan traction, spurred not by partisan guilt, but by undeniable public pressure. What started in a Dallas courtroom now echoed in the halls of Congress. But the real legacy wasn't in D.C. It was in the packed courtroom galleries across Texas, where judges began to shift, even subtly, watching their tone, checking their bias, knowing that silence was no longer a shield. It was in the cities that adopted Jasmine's model task force to monitor courtrooms and protect citizens from abuse of power. It was in the young black girl in Oak Cliff who watched Jasmine on TV and said, "I want to be like her." She didn't back down. 3 months later, Jasmine returned to the very spot where it all began. Courtroom 3B. It was quiet, empty. The bench sat untouched. The seal of the court above it gleamed in the overhead lights. But something was different. It felt lighter. She walked to the defense table, touched the worn wood with her fingers. Then she turned and walked out. Head high, steps calm, mission in motion. Justice hadn't been served in a day, but it had, finally, been heard.